Hey everyone, Jordan Rosenberg here from Beerman Law, and I'm joined today with Michael Terranova of Kogan & Power, and he is my main man and personal injury lawyer, and good friend. And so glad to be joined by him today to talk a little bit about the basics of personal injury and what that looks like during this COVID time. So Mike, welcome, and thanks for coming today.
Thank you very much for having me, Jordan. And I really appreciate an opportunity to get out and talk to you, even if it's over the telephone or computer.
Looking forward to it. So, Mike, one of the things that a lot of people I think don't know. So when someone says, Jordan, you're a family law lawyer, what I tell them is I do divorce, I do prenuptial agreements, I do things related to custody or allocation of parental responsibilities, child support, maintenance, stuff like that. But when someone says PI or personal injury, what does that involve? What cases does that include?
So personal injury is an all-encompassing term. And so what's going to fall under the umbrella, if you will, of personal injury is going to be something that happened, which we consider a premises liability case. So meaning that you got hurt at a store, you got hurt at a mall, you got hurt at a friend's house, someone got hurt at your home, and they're going to file a lawsuit against you. That's considered premises liability. Probably the most common personal injury case is going to be an automobile accident, which everyone's familiar with, like a rear end collision. And so those parties engage in what would be considered a personal injury claim for their physical damage, for their damage to their body, not the damage to their property. And then probably the most sophisticated type of personal injury cases would be those that fall under like a medical malpractice. And that's going to be when a doctor commits what's considered medical like negligence on an individual, and it results in permanent or serious damages. And those, then you would initiate a personal injury case under that umbrella, but it would be the subcategory of medical malpractice. The biggest and most important thing you can do if you're involved in an incident where someone's hurt, whether it be you or someone in your family, is that you contact legal counsel immediately. And I know that that's like, kind of a generic line that a lot of lawyers say, but the importance of it on a personal injury matter is it's grand. Because if you don't get that information right away, if you can't secure the vehicle, make sure that you understand what happened, maybe track down a witness if there's witnesses around there or something like that, can be the difference between having a successful case and not.
So let's say I actually slip and fall at a grocery store. How do I recover? Who pays me? What's the limit? Am I limited in my recovery? How do I get money from an injury?
We initiate contact with them, and when that goes nowhere, we file a lawsuit. And when that lawsuit's filed, they have no choice but to respond to that. And different from the area of law that you practice in, we're 100% paid on contingency basis. So there's never money put up for us to do our job. We only recover something at the very end of it. So sometimes people are reluctant to make a phone call because they're concerned, well, if I don't have a case, I don't want to have to pay this guy to tell me anything. But that's not how we work. We operate in a manner where we only take a percentage at the completion. And if we don't have a successful outcome, but we have put expenses on the file, we eat those expenses. So that's why on my end, it's important to know the facts, to know whether or not I should invest money into these cases because they will be successful at the end or not. If it looks bad, then we would say, I don't think there's anything here. We're not going to go any further with it. And you also mentioned one thing too, that you were saying, is there a limit to what I can get? And that limit, again, I mentioned earlier, there's a BI, it goes under bodily injury category of your insurance. Well, everyone's got that. And so general rule of thumb is that that's what your damages would be capped at. So if they have a $100,000 case, that's the $100,000 coverage for bodily injury. That's the most you're going to get. There's a lot of nuance there, and I can get into it. I'd probably be a separate podcast to talk about insurance with you. But the long and short is that that category is pretty much going to be it, barring any additional maybe umbrella coverages or if it's a large corporation, they generally carry some additional lines. But pretty much, you know, when you get an idea of what that person, who that person is insured by, what company, you have an idea of how much money there is for you to go after. So Jordan, one question I have for you, and something that I get a lot of times, unfortunately, from some of my clients, is that during their personal injury case, they initiate a divorce proceedings. And so I'm curious as to whether or not the proceeds from that settlement or jury verdict, whatever it is, from their personal injury case, become a marital asset to be handled in their divorce.
It's a really good question, and one that we've wrestled with a couple times and we get pretty often, actually. And I think the answer to that question really is more complicated than what anybody wants it to be. And I think that it boils down to sort of when the settlement is received, when the injury occurs, and for what purpose it was paid. I think what happens a lot of times is judges just divide the settlement equitably. Meaning if someone's really hurt and they get a settlement for their injury, a lot of the times I'll see judges say, well, you know, yes, it is a marital asset because technically it is money and an asset that comes to a marriage during the marriage, so it's presumed a marital asset. But what they often do is they disproportionately allocate it to the injured person. So a lot of the cases that deal with personal injury settlements say, you know, the injured person sometimes gets 70% or 80% or 90% or 60%, depending really on the facts and circumstances of the case. And so the second issue is if it's received after the divorce. And let's say that somebody, you know, a payor has a maintenance or child support obligation and is under a percentage order. There are a myriad of cases that say one-time lump sum settlements are considered additional income for child support. The classic counter argument is to say, well, that amount to the payee spouse, meaning the spouse that's receiving the money, is going to receive a windfall for additional money that they ordinarily, that exceeds the needs of the child in terms of child support. So a lot of the times I think what judges do is they say, yeah, you're entitled to the 20%, but we're going to deviate downward from the 20% and say you get 10% of it or you get 5% of it. And so I think a lot of the time really it just depends on the amount and when it's paid. But that's a great question. So Mike, we are in a uncertain time right now during the COVID crisis. And on a lot of my podcasts, we talk about certain situations and what's going on in COVID and how that impacts certain industries and people. But anything on the personal injury front, I mean, is there going to be this new thing called COVID liability?
Sure, good question. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you a lawyer answer because those are the times that we're in right now. And it's completely unprecedented. The legal system hasn't really put out any guidance as to how we're going to handle this. But there's been a lot of chatter, and I can give you kind of 2 points of that chatter. The first is something called an employer to employee waiver. And so these things, they're being drafted, they're being kind of proposed and floated around, and even some of them made their way to the actual line of workers and employees. And what that essentially is the employer is giving all the employees a piece of paper and saying, if you're going to work here, you have to waive your right to suing me or claiming a workers' compensation case if you in fact contract the COVID-19 while working at our establishment. It's going to be very difficult to pinpoint when in fact you did catch it, right? And so there'd be a lot of litigation on that. The second thing I want to touch on though as well is that there's a lot of rumblings, and there's actually something, if you go online, you can search it and see some of the language that there's a group of congressmen and congresswomen that have initiating an employer liability, essentially employer immunity for any cases of COVID. And so that would mean that if anyone were to contract COVID, and no employers would be responsible for it whatsoever. They would be immune from any liability.
Really, things really change by the week, obviously, with COVID, right? And that's
Right.
a really interesting point that you bring up, because a lot of people, and while we're transitioning a lot of the time in a lot of different industries to a remote atmosphere and a virtual environment, there's a lot of companies and businesses and work where that's not possible, or not possible to do it as effectively. And so
Right.
my assumption is there's a lot of employers who are looking at the situation saying, well, we have to have people come back to work to do what our business does. And a lot of employees who are going to be hesitant to come back to work because of COVID. And so
Right.
what I'm thinking, just based on what you're telling me, is it sounds like there's going to be a lot of litigation surrounding employees' rights and contracting COVID. Thanks, Mike, so much for joining me today and talking a little bit about personal injury and sort of the 101s and what that looks like in terms of this COVID time. So, Mike, do you want to share your contact information and how people can reach out to you if they have any questions?
Yeah, that'd be great. Again, my name's Mike Terranova. I work at the law firm of Kogan and Power. I'm going to give you my cell phone because that's the easiest way to get a hold of me, and that's 312-685-8432. Again, 312-685-8432. If you have any questions regarding any of the stuff we talked about or even more detail, please don't hesitate to give me a call. I'm happy to field questions. One thing we get is sometimes people are a little reluctant to call. It's literally my job to answer my phone. So if you have a question, pick it up, and I'm happy to help you, or at least help answer a question for you. Thank you very much for having me, Jordan. This is a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Of course. And again, Jordan Rosenberg from Beerman Law, 312-262-2567, and Jay Rosenberg at BeermanLaw.com. Thanks, everybody.